Today's scripture reading is taken from Genesis 6, verses 5 to 22. It's Genesis 6, verses 5 to 22. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. The Lord saw the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things, and the birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you, and they shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come into you, to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. This is the word of the Lord.
Our message today, we're going to be taking a second look at the story of Noah's Ark. Now, it's one of those stories which we often grow up with, everybody knows it, but it's treated as a fairy tale. So today we're going to kind of get right down into it and say, okay, is it real? Is it not real? And we're going to have a real good look at what the Bible has to say. And not just what the Bible has to say, but what the evidence is there. Now, as my brother will tell you, I'm a cynic and a critic at heart. I really am. It's nothing short of a miracle that I'm a Christian and I'm stood in front of you today, because I question absolutely everything. And I think most of us, particularly young people, are these days. Particularly if you look at the television, we're definitely questioning our politicians at the moment. We question our doctors, our religions. I mean, when I see patients coming in, they're always asking me, well, I've looked this up on the internet and this. Are you sure you really want to give me this, that, and the other? We don't believe anything anymore. So how on earth do we take a story like Noah's Ark? That Noah is told to build a boat 450 feet long, fill it full of animals, because the whole world's going to get covered with the flood and all mankind's going to get wiped out. It sounds just ridiculous. So today, we're going to have a little look at it. It's still an incredibly popular story. I have a £2 coin at home with a picture of a dove and an olive branch on it. No matter where you go, it's there. Now, hopefully this will work. And I'm going to show you a little something special. This is the mountain region of Ararat, and Greenpeace recently built an ark there. This is only about 10 meters long. It's nowhere near as big as the original, so no, you couldn't get many animals in there. But it's a story that just won't go away. This one was built as a shelter for mountaineers climbing up the mountain, and they were trying to raise awareness of the fact that we are wiping most of the animals off the planet. We don't need a flood to do it anymore. We're doing it ourselves. Now, this one's really interesting. This is in Hong Kong. This ark is life-size. It's been built by 3 billionaire brothers, the Kwok brothers, who are Christian. It contains a hotel, a restaurant, a museum, an exhibition centre, and 79 pairs of fiberglass animals. And they've built it on an island just off Hong Kong. And they're encouraging people to come to it as a visitor centre. Interestingly, they're finding it quite hard to advertise to mainland China because a lot of the people on mainland China aren't familiar with the story of Noah's Ark. So they're having to advertise it to them as a family fun day to come and see. So, when we're faced with this, I think really when you look at anything, there are three really big questions that we have to answer. The first question is it true? When I became a Christian, I had to look at all the stuff and say, look, is this really true or is it a load of rubbish? And I think it's one of the questions that we really have to look at today, which we will. Right. Second question, is it relevant? Even if it's true, what does that mean to me? And the third question is really, so what? Even if it's true, even if it has some relevance, do I really need to do anything about it? Can't I just carry on living my life the way I always have done? So, next thing we're looking at, come on guys. I told you modern technology is a problem. Right. So, is it true? Is it, just as the picture would suggest, a children's story? Is the Bible, that little book in the corner, is it just a book of fables? Is it a book of history? What is it? Is it even worth bothering to think about? So, there's two types of evidence that we can look at. There's physical evidence, there's things like fossils and geology, and there's historical evidence, the accounts we have in history of whether these kind of things actually took place. Next slide, please, Gaby. We're having trouble. Thank you. This is a slide from the film Evan Almighty. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's very good. It's a man in modern day times who's told to build an ark because his town's going to be flooded. And he has the same problem Noah does. Nobody believes him. Is it really possible to get all these animals, as I said in the children's story, coming in 2 by 2? Can it really happen? Well, the Bible says that God called the animals. So pretty much, I think we have to take that as a miracle. You either take that or leave it. Or you believe that Noah went out and got them. Because I think walking a lion and a springbok in side by side is a sure recipe for disaster. What's interesting is when I was looking at this story, I was looking on lots of different websites and lots of different sources. I came across one, which was an atheist website trying to debunk the whole story of Noah's Ark. And I printed off 11 pages of arguments he had for why this couldn't have happened. And I read these 11 pages, and I thought carefully, used a bit of common sense, a little bit of scientific knowledge that I had, and it took me about 5 minutes to chuck the whole lot in the idea as rubbish. Every single argument they had was very basic, and it didn't work. People are very angry about this story. It's something that really, really ticks people off. The first thing that they say is, well, you couldn't possibly fit all the species of animals that we have in the world in there now. You're right, we couldn't. But he didn't have to. All you need is one dog. You don't need a wolf, a husky, a poodle, an Alsatian. You don't need all of them. You need one dog. One of the popular conceptions people have about Christians is that we're really quite stupid. I hate to say it, but they really do. They think we're quite stupid because they think that God made everything and everything is rigid. I don't know about you. Have anybody put your hand up if you've ever learned something new? I'm learning to drive at the moment, so we can all do something new, can't we? We have the ability to change, to do new things. Animals are no different. We see it happening around the world now, animals changing colour, changing sizes. And we believe the same thing. If you have one dog, given enough time, they'll become lots of different types of dogs. Still a dog. A poodle and an Alsatian, they may not be able to necessarily mate and produce weird creations in between, but they're both dogs. So you don't need millions and millions of animals. That one. Fossils. Don't fossils prove that this is all a load of rubbish? Well, that's the next interesting point. And the answer again is unfortunately no. Interestingly, one of the things that they don't advertise very much when you watch these David Attenborough programs, when they look at the fossils and they say we have this in this layer and this in this layer, and so this one is 10 million years old and this is 100 million years old because it's below this one. What they don't actually tell you is that they found trees buried vertically through several fossil layers all in one go. So you have something which is 50 million years old, 100 million years old, 150 million years old, and a tree going right down the middle of it. They find it pretty hard to explain that one, understandably enough. They've had a good go, and I've had a look at the arguments, but they're not terribly convincing. The other thing is insects like this little dragonfly here are very soft. Unless you bury it very quickly, which doesn't happen very often, you're pretty hard-pressed to get something like a dragonfly or a leaf or something like that surviving. So yes, it happens now and again, but we have these things everywhere. We have layers of rock up a mountain about 100 miles above sea level with loads and loads and loads of seashells in them. There's lots of things which just don't quite make sense. So, it's quite possible that they're wrong. The other thing which is quite interesting for any of you who are physicists is if you look at radioactivity. Some rocks are radioactive. They have little elements of things in there which are radioactive. And as they release their radioactivity, they form a little ring, a bit like Saturn's rings outside them, of radioactive material embedded in the rock. And it's very pretty. You can cut them open and look at it under a microscope and you see these nice little rings. Now the clever thing about them is there's one particular element called polonium. And it breaks down really, really quickly, in microseconds. A different type of polonium breaks down in 134 seconds, and another one breaks down in a couple of days. Interestingly, when you cut open these rocks that are supposed to be millions of years old and formed over millions of years, you find these nice little circles of radioactivity from these elements that last less than a second. And yet they'll tell you that this layer took millions of years to lay down. If that's true, how is it that there's a little radioactive ring there which would have lasted less than a second, but you can see it in a rock? The only way it can happen is if everything just went bang in one go. Interesting. A lot of the arguments that we have are based on things like carbon-14 dating. I'm sure you've all heard of it. And they take a bit of tree or something and they look at the radioactivity in it. What they don't tell you is that carbon-14 dating is accurate to 10,000 years, and beyond that, it's very inaccurate. But not just that, it makes one very interesting assumption, that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has been the same throughout all human history. Now, all you've got to do is look at what we're doing to the environment now to realize that that doesn't quite work. We're pumping out so much CO2 into the atmosphere, we're destroying the greenhouse. We're getting a greenhouse effect with this layer of ozone and everything. That changes the way the elements are. If you had something really big and dramatic happen in history, like the whole of the Earth getting covered with water, with changes in the atmosphere and everything, I would imagine that would kind of change things just a little bit. And so some of the dating methods that we make, looking at things that are fossils or dinosaurs or whatever they are, they make lots of layers of assumptions in order to prove it. Now there's lots of arguments on one side and on the other. But what I want to do today is just raise a little question in your mind. So when you look at these things, don't always accept what you hear. Don't accept it from me. Don't accept it from them. Don't accept it from anything. Look into it yourself. Next question is... Come on. Next slide, please, KB. Is what about the Ark itself? People question whether or not it could even have been built. Well, this is Noah's Ark on a scale against some other boats, old and modern. The estimates vary depending on whether you use an Egyptian cubit or a Hebrew one, but it's basically somewhere between 450 and 500 feet long. Essentially the size of a small aircraft carrier. They question whether or not somebody could have built something like that. Well, the interesting thing is we have lots of debates about how things like the pyramids are built, and nobody thinks they could build them now. So we're debating how a civilization around several thousand years ago could have built something when we already know they built things that we can't do now. Bit of a dumb argument, but there you go. They've looked into these things. They've built scale models of it. It floats. One team in America built a scale model of Noah's Ark, not the full size, obviously, put it in a huge, great big tank and exposed it to flood-type conditions. They put wave machines and all sorts of things in to see if the boat would tip over, flip upside down, or just fall apart. Surprisingly, it took everything and will still end at the end of... They tested it for an entire day in a huge, great big tank, the size of this room. It survived everything they threw at it. So yes, it could have been built. Well, has anybody actually found the Ark, I suppose is the next question. Can we have the next slide, please, Katie? Could an Ark which survived all of that and landed up on the mountain regions of Ararat, will he be around today? Well, if you actually go to Turkey, the Turkish government will tell you that they found Noah's Ark. You can go on a little website, and there's even a road sign which says "to Noah's big boat" in Turkish. It's actually there for a huge big rock formation, which scientists are still arguing about to this day. They think they found fossilized timber and bits of metal there. There's lots of debates, frankly. The answer is no, we haven't found it. There's lots of tantalizing hints here, there, and everywhere in different places. The Turkish government has opened up a big museum and big signs around this, but to be honest, the main reason they've probably done it is to raise lots of money from the tourist trade. But there's lots of interesting historical evidence, even from people who were Jewish. There's a famous Jewish historian called Josephus Flavius. He wrote that at the time of his writing, people could still go up and see the ark because it was still up on the mountainside. It was the equivalent of of the disciples saying in Bible times, if you don't believe us, go and ask them. When it talks about there being 300 witnesses to Christ's death and resurrection. In ancient times, people knew it was there. The one thing that they have found up on the mountain regions of Ararat, by the way, isn't one mountain. It's a mountain range. One thing that they have found is huge, great big old stones carved with Christian crosses on, which they think are thousands of years old. They don't think they've come from Noah's Ark, but what they do think is that people for thousands of years have been recognizing that something interesting happened around that region and trying to commemorate it somehow. What I'm going to show you next is a little video. And it's a little video of an explanation by a Christian professor in America of how potentially the flood situation could have happened. Now, I've looked at lots of different theories, and I think this is one of the best. It doesn't quite answer everything, and we'll talk a little bit about it in a minute. It lasts about 5 minutes long. It's a little bit old. It's about 10 years old, so please bear with the sound. It's a little bit muffled, but I think you'll find it very interesting. So please bear with the sound. It's a little bit muffled, but I think you'll find it very interesting.
See on our planet 17 very strange features which can now be systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 10 billion hydrogen bombs. This explanation shows us just how rapidly major mountains formed. It explains the coal and oil deposits, the rapid continental drift, why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches and hundreds of canyons and volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and most of the fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, but perhaps 9,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, the pre-flood Earth had a lot of subterranean water, about half of what is now in our oceans. This water was contained in interconnected chambers, forming a thin spherical shell about half a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the Earth's surface. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling rupture, fountains of water jetted supersonically almost 20 miles into the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rains, such as the earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago, which we can now tie together scientifically. Some of the water jetting high above the cold stratosphere goes into supercooled ice crystals and produce some massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settle out of this muddy water all over the earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
The demonstration you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
It's quite interesting when you see it put together like that. One thing I will say that they don't quite explain on that mid-oceanic ridge that you see lies in the middle of the Atlantic. And if you look on a globe, a good globe that shows it, it goes 1/3 of the way around the world. That's how big it is. It's massive. It goes right down the middle of the Atlantic for 1/3 of the diameter of the globe. It's huge. Now there is debate as well as to whether or not there was a layer of water above the earth. The Bible describes God separating the waters above from the waters below. And there is some debate that perhaps there was a thin shell of water around the earth as well, and that caved in. But what's interesting is that there are lots of different theories which can explain where individual things came from. There are very few theories which can pull the whole lot together into a cohesive picture. That's one of them. There are some holes in that theory, but by and large it seems to explain a lot of things that came through. Probably at the same time you had volcanoes forming at the same time as the earth broke up, forming all sorts of bits and pieces. And the reason the Bible says there was no rain beforehand was probably because of that water shell that you saw underneath the earth, which burst through, probably came through naturally as geysers and things that we have now, like in Yellowstone Park, and covered the earth with a very fine mist, a bit like dew every morning. So there was no need for rain to come from above. So there's lots of things which can potentially put it all together. Right, I'm going to see if this works one more time. There we go. Now, I talked about physical evidence. So that's a little hint, a little taster of physical evidence. If you want to have a look online. There's lots of different things out there. But now, I want to talk about something totally different. Right, and back. There we go. Right. These are Chinese pictograms. Now, it's interesting. I showed you the Hong Kong Ark at the beginning and said that they're having trouble selling this attraction to the Chinese because a lot of the mainland Chinese people don't know the story of Noah's Ark. But what's interesting is deep in their history, if you go back, they did know it. These are Chinese pictograms. The language has changed slightly now, but in the old Chinese style, they used to use these little symbols, which they still group together, although this changed slightly now. And interestingly, the Chinese pictogram for boat consists of vessel with 8 people. And there's similar things that you find in different languages around the world. Next slide. Interestingly also, the pictogram that they have for passing down knowledge comes from water and 8 people. So there's lots of things, and there's more. The more that you look into it, there's also Chinese pictograms describing the Garden of Eden, describing all sorts of bits and pieces to do with the Genesis story. And if anybody wants more information, come and see me afterwards and I'll point you in the direction. What's interesting is that lots of different cultures around the world have this story. This is a little table which goes through different civilizations. Everything from the Babylonians through the Fijians, Maoris, everything. And the chart basically shows features of the story, of the Noah's Ark story that are in the Bible. And the coloured in squares are the ones where they have things in common, where those traditions show elements of that story. So you see, most of those traditions all have stories of the earth being destroyed at some point, being covered by water, human beings being saved, there being an ark involved. There's very big core parts of the story which travel. In some nations of the world, the person involved in the story's name is Nuwa. In the Islamic tradition, it's Nu. There's lots of different elements of the story which are shockingly similar to what the Bible has to say. So if you don't just believe the physical evidence and you have questions about that, there's also virtually every culture on earth has this story in some form or another. The closest one is the old Assyrian story of Gilgamesh, the Gilgamesh epic, which again has a story of a man being told to build a boat because the earth is going to be flooded. They have slightly different variations on the theme. Some are told to do it by various gods, some are told to do it for other reasons. But when you look at it, it's all there. So, is it a children's story? Or is it something a little bit more? Is it relevant to us today? People often say that the Bible's full of metaphors. Is it just a warning about the fact that everything we do is being watched by someone on high, or we have to give account for something? Is it simply about the fact that God sees everything and we can't hide? Or is there something more in it? Everybody knows this one, I'm sure, from Indiana Jones. This is Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Is Noah's Ark just as much use as the Ark of the Covenant? Is it still another figment of somebody's imagination? Is it just another wooden box? Let's just think about that for a moment. When you look at the two of them, there's some interesting correlations. Noah's Ark contained a verbal history. All of the history of the world, if the Bible's correct, came from 8 people. And you have to wonder what they did stuck on a boat for a year. Now, if you look at Noah's family, his grandfather was around the same time Adam was. So there was a direct link between Noah being handed down those stories of what happened beforehand. So maybe they shared those stories, because where we have them, and when Noah's sons spread all over the different parts of the earth, maybe that's why we get the different variations in the story. Who knows? Noah's Ark obviously had food for all the animals on it. The Ark of the Covenant contained God's 10 Commandments. It had God's verbal law, if you like, in the same way it had verbal history on the Ark. The olive branch was a big symbol of budding, of new life to come. And the Ark of the Covenant contained Aaron, Moses' brother's staff, which budded to show that God's presence was with them and that he was the leader who was going to continue on the history. But really, when you look at it, there's something a bit bigger involved. Really, the story of Noah's Ark is about evolution and creation. And we're planning as the youth a special program for that. So if you're interested in that kind of thing and you want to learn more about it, you want to know whether dinosaurs were on the Ark or stuff like that, stay tuned, because it will come in the future. Really, it's about this. If the Bible's a load of rubbish, if the story's a load of rubbish, and we evolved from monkeys or apes or amoebas or whatever it is, we don't really have a reason to be here. The past and the present, there's no real purpose, there's no way of knowing what's going to happen in the future. We're just here. Do what you like, really. On the other side of things, if the story's real, then there was somebody watching from the beginning, there was a plan from the beginning, and there was a plan to move things through. Even though when things went wrong, there was a plan to move things along. And that's really what it comes down to. But at the end of the day, so what? Well, the Bible doesn't neglect the story of Noah. It doesn't just sort of dump it at the beginning of the Bible and then forget about it. It links it directly through to Jesus. In fact, the New Testament tells us that at the end of the world, the same kind of thing is going to be happening at the beginning. The people are going to come along and they're going to say, where's this Jesus is coming? He's not coming, it's a load of rubbish. Whoops. But at the same time, Noah had the same problems. People said to him, "Where's this rain? Where's it coming? I don't see any rain. What are you talking about?" But the rains came. Thank you, guys. The world was destroyed by water once. We're told it's going to be destroyed by fire the next time round. And that's slightly harder to swim out of the way of. And as the Bible says, just as it was in the time of Noah, so it will be now. At the time, everything was fine. They were partying, they were having marriages. It's interesting that the people who were on the ark, I don't know if you've realized this, when you look at their ages, Noah was 600 years old. His sons were about 100, which sounds ridiculous given what we are told now. But when you look at the history of mankind and how our genetic code has deteriorated, around the time that Noah gets in the ark, God says, mankind, I'm only going to let them live for 120 years maximum. Interestingly, when you look at our genetics, that's what we believe our genetic potential is now. That if you live as healthily as you can possibly be, the chances are you'll make it to about 120 and not much more. Which is exactly what God said it would be. But those people who were on the ark at the time, people didn't have kids until they were 70. None of Noah's sons or his wives had children. So the world was restarted with youth, effectively, and 2 older people to guide them. Which is a kind of a message for the youth here, that you've got to listen to the older ones, because somewhere along the line they're going to guide you, but at the end of the day, the future is the youth. So you've got to get smart, you've got to get with the program, you've got to understand what's going on, and you need to know what's truth and what isn't. Because at the end of the day, we look at the politicians of now, the politicians of the future are going to come from the young people. If you want them to be upright, if you don't want them to fiddle their accounts, their expenses, they have to have a worldview which says that that's not a good thing to do. People said peace and safety. People said there's no rain, it's not going to be a problem. Disaster came upon them. The Bible tells us the same thing's going to happen now. Why should you believe it? Well, we've already said, the Bible said it happened once, and we've had to look at some proof which says maybe it just did. So maybe, just maybe, we should take it seriously. What's our reaction to that? Well, Noah was told to be, he was the only man in his generation who had any real relationship with God. He was the only man who had a sense of what was right and what's wrong. And that's really the way that we have to be. We have to step out from the crowd. If the rest of the politicians are fiddling their accounts and doing whatever, and that's your calling, don't. If you're the kind of person who sees people stealing stuff from the office, don't. We have to have a sense of being different. Noah was a brave man, and we're all here because of it. If he hadn't, goodness knows what would have happened. There is always a reason for hope. Just as God sent the dove with the olive branch for Noah, there's a reason for hope for us. We said this is a story of metaphors, possibly. Well, let's just look at a few more. We looked at the 2 different arks. Let's look at the ark and Jesus. I said that the Bible doesn't neglect the story. It links it all the way straight through. Well, at the flood, there was lots of rain, and the skies probably went dark with all the clouds. The same thing happened when Jesus died. The earth was broken. We know that. We've just seen it from the hydroplate theory video. It says the mountains of the deep broke forth. And on the day that Jesus died, there was a massive earthquake, and the tombs of the dead were broke open. There was plenty of water and blood around. There was lots of water for sure. And there was lots of people being broken and blood being spilt on that day. And when Jesus died, exactly the same thing happened. He shed water and blood from his side when they stuck a spear in his side. And he died of a broken heart. He died of heart failure. We had a boat and a storm at one point made of wood. We had a man nailed to a bit of wood at the other end of the story. So what? It's the same God at the beginning and at the end. He's no different. Same problems with us, same wicked people. We still get up to mischief. But there's still a plan. There is still an ark. Only this time the ark isn't a wooden boat. It's a man. When I was a youth, when I used to come to church, one of the main things that I refused to get baptized after a campaign. You know why? Because people always used to end their messages with saying, accept Jesus today because you might die tomorrow. And I used to think that's a terrible thing to say. But it may well be true. You know, we've heard of planes falling out of the sky in the news recently and everything else. But I really don't like that. I don't like that because you know why? The Bible says that fear is to do with the fear of punishment. Christians have nothing to be afraid of. You shouldn't choose to become a Christian because you're afraid you're going to die. You should choose to become a Christian today because you want to really start living today. Because you're fed up of all the doubt. You're fed up of all the worries and all the rubbish and all the strife going on. You're fed up of having a life that has no meaning. You're fed up of having a life that has no purpose. Don't choose to live because you're afraid to die. Choose to live because you really want to live. It happened once, it will happen again. I just want to close by reading a short passage of Scripture. It's in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. And it says, God waited patiently in the days of Noah when the ark was being built. In it only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a good conscience towards God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Bible never ever neglected the story. God never neglected the story. It was integral throughout the whole Bible. And right at the end it says, there was water that cleansed the earth now. And if you want to be saved this time round, you have to be cleansed by water again. I want to make a request of the young people. I'm not going to ask you to come up front because I know people get embarrassed by doing that. But as we bow our heads to pray for a moment, if you're a young person, or for that matter, an older person, if you're fed up with seeing a world which is just a mess, if you're fed up with doubting and wondering what is really real in this life, if you're fed up of hearing stuff which doesn't really make sense, I just want you as we just close our eyes and bow our heads now, just to raise your hand. Let God see you. God likes you to make a move. Noah had to build a boat. I want you to just bow your heads, close your eyes. I don't want anyone to see you. Just raise your hand if you want God to start changing, if you want to live today. If you don't want to choose him because you're afraid to die and there'll be nothing else. But if you want to start living, just bow your heads with me. Dear Lord, today we've taken a second look at a story which we've known since we were children. Perhaps we've been taught that it was just that, a children's story. But your word says that it was a true event, that it happened, and that the earth bears the scars of it for us to see today. And that story resounds throughout all generations because it's a story of you wanting what's best for us and doing whatever it takes to make that happen. Once it meant that you had to change the world. The second time it meant you had to come here yourself. And instead of the world being broken, it was you. Today we just ask your help to find out what is truth in this world, which is very changeable. And the things that we think we can trust, we sometimes find out we can't. Lord, I pray for all those people who are raising their hands right now, who just want, in a special way, for you to make a move in their life, to show them clearly what is truth and what is not, to give them a real sense of purpose. Maybe they're struggling with finding a job, maybe they're struggling with their studies, I don't know what it is, but I know that you do. Because in the same way that you knew to put Noah on that boat, you know to call us to bring us here today. I just pray that you will bless us in everything that we say and think and do, and bring us into a deeper relationship with you and a greater understanding of what is truth in this life, so that before we do die, whenever that time does come, we will know that we have made our peace with you and that we are looking forward to something bigger and better than what we have right now. So bless us, strengthen us, and give us peace, I pray, in Christ's name.